June 26, 1943. Late day over occupied France near Forges-les-Eaux. In a P-47 Thunderbolt, Lieutenant Robert Johnson watched a swarm of B-17s swing homeward after striking Villacoublay airfield outside Paris. 23 years old, 2 months in combat, he had just one confirmed victory, claimed less than 2 weeks earlier over the Netherlands. Today, he was about to learn whether the airplane many doubted could actually save its pilot when pushed past all sane limits. The P-47 was the biggest single-engine fighter in service, about 5 tons empty, nearly 8 3/4 tons at takeoff. A 2-row, 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 powered it. 8 Browning .50 caliber guns armed it. It was fast in level flight, lethal in thin air, and terrifying in a dive. But it had a weakness that cost American lives. It could not outturn German fighters. The Focke-Wulf 19 and Messerschmitt 109 were smaller and more agile. In a flat, sustained turn at medium height, the Jug lost. Against seasoned opponents, that could be fatal.
U.S. doctrine warned P-47 pilots never to turn with German fighters. Use energy, dive in from altitude, shoot and climb away, hit and run. Johnson had tried to fly that way since his first mission on April 18, 1943. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. The Luftwaffe knew how to lure Americans into bad fights and how to exploit the Thunderbolt's weaknesses. The 8th Air Force had been losing P-47s since the type entered combat in March. The learning curve was steep, and the price was measured in young lives. Johnson had seen friends die, good men who strapped in full of training and came back in coffins, or never came back at all. Reports blamed pilot error, instructors blamed deviations from doctrine. Survivors knew the truth. Combat is messy, and the enemy doesn't follow your playbook. Sometimes you end up in a turning fight, whether you want to or not.
At 19,000 feet, 48 P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group spread across the sky in loose cover for the bombers. Johnson flew tail-end Charlie, the exposed last slot that often went to newer pilots. He scanned high into the sun where an ambush might come. Then he saw them. 16 FW-190s from 2nd JG-26, dropping from around 25,000 feet, fast. He thumbed the radio to warn his leader, but before he finished, the first Focke-Wulf fired. 20mm shells tore through his P-47. The canopy burst. Shards filled the cockpit. Hydraulic fluid splashed his face, burning his eyes. A machine gun round grazed his nose and shredded his oxygen mask. Another struck his right leg and split. Fire bloomed in the cockpit. The Jug flipped into an inverted spin. Blinded by oil and fluid, gasping without oxygen at 19,000 feet, fighting dead hydraulics, he tumbled like dropped masonry. He tried to bail out, braced his feet and yanked the canopy, but the shot-up mechanism wouldn't move. Trapped in a burning, spinning fighter, he thought of his wife, Barbara, accepted he was finished, and stopped fighting.
Then the flames guttered out, starved by the wind blast and thin air. Johnson kicked left rudder, eased the stick, and the nose came up. The spin stopped. Level at 8,000 feet, half-blind, bleeding, with no oxygen, no hydraulic pressure, and no idea how bad the damage was, he turned for England and pushed the throttle forward. The big R2800 still ran. A Focke-Wulf slid alongside his left wing. Through the smeared canopy, Johnson saw the German pilot stare at the shredded P-47, then slide behind and open fire again. With 20mm ammo apparently spent, the German raked him at close range with rifle-caliber guns. Johnson hunched behind the armor plate. The Jug shook under the hammering, metal screaming, aluminum punctured, the cockpit reeking of cordite and hot oil. The attacker came up again, shook his head in disbelief, then made more passes, spraying with rudder to walk his fire across from tip to tip. Any normal fighter should have come apart. The P-47 did not. After multiple runs, the German finally ran dry. He formed up once more, rocked his wings in a professional salute, and turned back toward France. Johnson coaxed the crippled Jug across the channel. With no flaps, no gear hydraulics, no radio, blurred vision, a burned face, and a bleeding leg, he found RAF Manston, the emergency field on the coast, lined up beside the runway, chopped power, and slid the Thunderbolt in on its belly. It skidded across the grass and stopped. Ground crew pried him out. His hands were locked on the stick, and his legs wouldn't respond. He tried to count the holes and quit after 200 on one side. Later tallies found dozens of 20mm hits and hundreds of smaller strikes. The airplane was a write-off. It had still brought him home.
No one on the field that evening realized the story would become legend. What Johnson had just proven about the Thunderbolt would ripple through the group. The Jug could take punishment no other fighter would survive, and still get a pilot home. That same day, the 56th paid a heavy price. Among those lost was Lieutenant Roger B. Dyer, a gifted flyer who had trained with Johnson back in the States. In mid-1942, the 56th Fighter Group began breaking in the first P-47Bs around Bridgeport, Stratford, Connecticut, essentially test flying and teaching at the same time. Facilities were poor, the runways short, and the aircraft had early teething troubles. By Johnson's own account, the group suffered more than 40 crashes and 18 fatalities during that period, losses he partly blamed on the inadequate airfield. Dyer had already brushed up against the limits of the new fighter. On November 13, 1942, he and Lieutenant Harold E. Comstock dove steeply from high altitude and ran into severe compressibility, their controls locking as the airframe approached transonic flow. Post-war analysis makes clear they did not break the sound barrier. They were likely near Mach 0.85 to 0.90, which was still hair-raising in 1942 and a wake-up call about P-47 dive behavior. Both recovered, both survived. Then, 7 months later, Dyer was gone. One of 5 Thunderbolts destroyed and 4 pilots killed when TI times JG-26 pounced on the 56th over Forges-les-Eaux on June 26, 1943, the same ambush that crippled Johnson's fighter. In chaotic, 20-minute swirling fights like that, the difference between life and death could be seconds, angles, and plain chance. The P-47's mass and toughness could swing outcomes. Sometimes it didn't.
Through that summer, the group kept learning. Doctrine said, dive, shoot, climb, don't turn, but the most successful pilots treated it as a starting point, not a rulebook. Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, older than most and a veteran RAF observer from 1940, pushed hard debriefs and shared tactics across flights. The shift was subtle. Keep the altitude edge, manage energy, press multiple high-speed attacks when you could, without dropping into flat, slow turns. Confidence in the Jug's power and ruggedness encouraged aggression. Press, then climb back to reset. Results followed. On October 8, 1943, Johnson scored his 5th and became an ace during a violent series of combats near Bremen that also cost the Luftwaffe one of its stars, Oberstleutnant Hans Philipp of JG-1, 206 victories. Philipp bailed out too low and was killed when his parachute failed. Sources disagree on who fired the fatal bursts, and the precise sequence remains debated, but Johnson's attack was part of that engagement. For years, some retellings named Egon Mayer as the FW-190 pilot who raked Johnson's shot-up Jug on June 26 and then saluted him before breaking away. modern research doesn't back that identification. Mayer was killed later on March 2, 1944, near Montmedy, shot down by P-47s, and there's no firm German claim tying him to Johnson's June fight. The attacking pilot over France that day remains unknown. By autumn, German reports show mounting frustration. The Thunderbolt drivers were staying in longer, using vertical extensions better, and were much harder to shake once committed. Meanwhile, attrition eroded the Luftwaffe's veteran corps faster than training could replace it, while U.S. logistics and mentorship pipelines kept 8th Air Force units supplied and paired new wingmen with seasoned leaders. The airplane hadn't changed, understanding had. Through the late summer of 1943, the 56th refined how it fought. The best results came from pilots who treated dive, shoot, climb as a foundation, then adapted in the moment. Start high, make a fast attack, but if energy remained, press again from a new angle, always climbing back to reset before the fight devolved into flat turns where German fighters excelled. Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke drove this learning with relentless debriefs and cross-unit sharing. He'd observed RAF tactics in 1940 and knew wartime doctrine had to evolve in real time. The airplane hadn't changed, the understanding had. By early autumn, that shift showed up in combat. German reports and Allied narratives alike describe Thunderbolt pilots staying in engagements longer, using vertical maneuvers more effectively, and proving harder to shake once committed, while still refusing any low-level sustained turn fights. At the same time, attrition bit the Luftwaffe. Veterans were lost faster than training could replace them, while U.S. logistics and mentorship pipelines kept the 8th Air Force's group supplied and paired new wingmen with seasoned leaders. The results were measured in missions. On October 4, 1943, long-range escort to Frankfurt pushed fuel planning and endurance, but the group brought home kills with acceptable losses. Evidence the Jug could do the job when flown to its strengths. 4 days later, on October 8th, Robert S. Johnson reached ace status during heavy fighting near Bremen. In that same series of engagements, Oberstleutnant Hans Philipp of JG-1, 206 victories, was killed after bailing out too low and was killed when his parachute failed. Sources differ on who fired the fatal bursts, and the precise sequence remains debated, but Johnson's attack occurred within that combat. One legend needed pruning. For years, some accounts named Egon Mayer as the FW-190 pilot who savaged Johnson's Jug on June 26 and later saluted him. Modern research doesn't support that. Mayer was killed later, March 2, 1944, near Montmedy by P-47s, and there's no firm German claim tying him to Johnson's June fight. The identity of Johnson's attacker that day remains unknown. What never changed was physics. At lower altitudes and in sustained level turns, the Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109 could outturn and often outclimb a P-47. What changed was the refusal to fight on those terms. Thunderbolt pilots leaned into altitude, dive speed, and the Jug's structural brute strength, pulling high-G vertical maneuvers that German fighters couldn't match without risking failure, then used the big Pratt & Whitney R-2800 to claw back up and reset. Confidence-fed tactics. Knowing the airplane could take punishment and still fly home encouraged decisive, repeated attacks rather than one timid pass and a long, vulnerable egress. By year's end, the 56th was proving what the type could do. The group is credited by the Air Force Historical Research Agency with roughly 665.5 air-to-air victories, the top P-47 group and top in the 8th Air Force. Its aces became household names: Francis Gabby Grabeski at 28 victories in the ETO, Robert S. Johnson at 27, David C. Schilling around 22.5. Wider statistics often quoted for the Jug underscore why pilots trusted it. 15,683 built, an aerial kill ratio around 4.6 to 1, and a remarkably low 0.7% loss per mission, numbers frequently referenced by museums and histories. Treat these as aggregated USAAF figures rather than theater-specific absolutes. Methodologies differ, but the big picture stands. The P-47 was fast, tough, and survivable when flown to its strengths. The breakthrough wasn't a new airframe, it was a new mindset. By autumn 1943, the Jug's strengths, altitude, dive speed, toughness, and heavy guns were being used on purpose, not by accident. When flown that way, the P-47 was a problem the Luftwaffe struggled to solve. But the air war kept changing. As the bomber offensive pushed deeper, range began to rule everything. The P-51 Mustang would eventually shoulder most long-range escort to targets like Berlin, while the P-47 Thunderbolt increasingly switched to a second, equally brutal job, smashing the German war machine on the ground. The shift didn't diminish the Jug, it weaponized what made it special. Its air-cooled R-2800 could absorb hits that would down liquid-cooled fighters. Its rugged frame and dive performance made it a natural for low-level attack. From D-Day to VE Day, Thunderbolts roamed France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, strafing columns, rail yards, depots, and airfields. Contemporary and later histories often quote striking USAAF claim totals for that 11-month span. About 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 rail cars, 68,000 trucks, and thousands of other vehicles wrecked or damaged by P-47 units. Treat these as claims rather than audited counts. Even so, the effect on German logistics was unmistakable. Daylight rail movement became deadly, road convoys hid or died, and frontline units felt the shortage in fuel and ammunition. Pilots respected the price of this mission. Ground attack meant running into flak at low altitude, dealing with blast and debris on pullout, and landing with airframes stitched by light guns. The cure for that was the same as in air combat: speed and strength. Dive steep, release, and use the Thunderbolt's ability to yank through a hard recovery and keep flying.
None of this erased the P-47's original story. It remained a high-altitude fighter that it entered combat in April 1943 and earned a reputation for ruggedness while escorting bomber streams. By war's end, more than 15,600 had been built, an industry of Jugs that served nearly everywhere the U.S. Army Air Forces flew. By late 1944 and into 1945, the picture was clear. Where the Thunderbolt chose the fight, high, fast, and vertical, it was deadly. Where the Luftwaffe tried to drag it low into flat turns, the Jugs simply refused. The airplane hadn't been reinvented, the pilots had. They learned faster, shared faster, and fought on their own terms. The 56th Fighter Group became the proof. Official histories credit the unit with about 665.5 air-to-air victories, the highest scoring group in the 8th Air Force, and the top P-47 outfit overall. Its leading names became shorthand for the type's potential. Francis Gabby Gebreski with 28 in the ETO, Robert S. Johnson with 27, David C. Schilling with 22 plus. Totals vary slightly by source, but the order of magnitude is consistent. The statistics that followed the Jug into museums and books underscored why pilots trusted it. First combat in April 1943, over 15,600 built. Famous for rugged construction, heavy armament, and high-altitude performance. Numbers like overall kill ratios and mission loss rates differ by dataset and theater, but the through line is stable. If you flew it to its strengths, it hit hard, dove like a hammer, and brought you home. The ground attack phase never lost its edge. After D-Day, P-47s punished rail hubs, road traffic, depots, and airfields across Western Europe.
Post-war narratives often quote striking USAAF claim totals: thousands of locomotives, tens of thousands of rail cars and trucks destroyed or damaged, best treated as claims rather than audited counts. Even so, the effect was visible in German logistics. Daylight rail movement became perilous, and frontline units felt the shortages. The myths were trimmed, too. On October 8, 1943, Oberst Lieutenant Hans Philipp of JG-1, 206 victories, died after bailing out too low during fighting near Bremen. Sources differ on who fired the decisive bursts, though Johnson's attack was part of that engagement. And the oft-repeated naming of Egon Meyer as Johnson's attacker on June 26, 1943, has no firm documentary basis. Meyer was killed later, on March 2, 1944, near Montmedy, shot down by P-47s. Johnson's June opponent remains unknown. Leadership mattered. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke took the 56th from skepticism about the big fighter to a doctrine that fit it like a glove, then was himself shot down by weather-induced structural failure on October 30, 1944, and spent the war's last months as senior Allied officer at Stalag Luft 1, organizing and safeguarding thousands of POWs until liberation.
After the guns went quiet, the Thunderbolt didn't vanish. More than a dozen air forces flew surplus P-47s: Brazil, Mexico, France, Italy, Portugal, Turkey, Iran, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Yugoslavia, and others, with some serving well into the 1950s-60s. At Republic, the design lineage continued in jets. The F-84 Thunderjet was a clean-sheet successor shaped by lessons from the Jug years, trading the radial's brawn for a slim fuselage and axial-flow turbojet, but keeping the fighter-bomber emphasis. One Thunderbolt story sits in aluminum today. P-47 D-40 RA, serial 4549167, built at Evansville, Indiana, was restored for display and later transferred from the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. It's often cited in features about surviving Jugs. The placard facts, First Combat April 1943, 8.50 cals, thousands produced, are accurate enough, but the deeper truth lives in operations reports. Pilots learned how to use the airplane they had, and they won. As for Robert S. Johnson, he finished with 27 victories in 91 missions, became one of the ETO's top American aces, and died on December 27, 1998. He's buried at River Hills Community Church Cemetery, Lake Wylie, South Carolina. The obituary bullet points can't carry what June 26th meant to him, but the wreckage photos and the Manston landing record the rest. At museums, the Thunderbolt story is told in metal rather than myth, a big radial up front, 8.50 caliber Brownings, and the scars to prove what pilots always said: it could take a beating and still fly. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force sums it up plainly: rugged, widely used, and built in more than 15,600 examples by war's end. One survivor often mentioned is P-47 D-40 RA, serial 4549167, an Evansville, Indiana airframe accepted in May 1945 that later appeared in museum displays painted as 5x5, echoing the 362nd Fighter Group. It's a tangible link to the type's late-war production run and its long post-war exhibit life. What the placards can't fully show is the lesson the Jug taught. Victory often comes from learning faster, not from owning the prettiest airplane. The P-47 never became a ballerina of the turn circle. It didn't need to. It won by energy, altitude, dive speed, firepower, and sheer toughness, and by pilots and leaders who shaped tactics around those strengths. That's the part veterans remembered. The idea outlived the war. At Republic Aviation, designer Alexander Kartveli moved on to a jet successor, the F-84 Thunderjet, not a re-engined P-47, but a clean-sheet fighter bomber conceived as the Jug's turbojet air once engineers realized a jet wouldn't fit the old airframe. The through line, straight wing, tough, heavily armed fighter-bomber work was deliberate. That lineage eventually produced another bruiser with a familiar name, Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II. Built explicitly for close air support, the A-10 kept the Republic DNA of armor, firepower, and survivability. Different era, same philosophy. The nickname isn't an accident.
And the people? Their arcs were just as telling. Hubert Hub Zemke, who helped turn skepticism into doctrine, was later shot down by weather, spent months as senior Allied officer at Stalag Luft I, and then continued a long post-war career, still teaching the lesson that tactics win wars as surely as machines do. Robert S. Johnson finished with 27 victories in 91 missions, and decades later was laid to rest in South Carolina, his June 26th fight still one of the most retold survival stories in the 8th Air Force. If there's a single takeaway, it's this. The Thunderbolt didn't become great by changing what it was. Pilots changed how they used it. They refused the wrong fight, chose the right one, and came home in a machine built to take the hit and keep going. That's why the Jug may never have been the most glamorous fighter, but it earned a different title in the hearts of its crews, the one that brought you back. If this story spoke to you, tap like so more people can find it. Subscribe to stay with us for more overlooked chapters of World War II. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from.